About 2014, the 4 West Slope Roundtables, and the Roundtables are a system created by the state to drive these kinds of water discussions down to a grassroots level. So we have four of 9 on the West Slope, and we started talking about, well, hey, you know, we might want to have the ability to develop more water, but, you know, and we might want to develop more than you can, but nobody had any numbers. And then the other side of the coin was, hey, if we're at risk of development, maybe we shouldn't curtail as much as somebody else. But again, we were talking about air because we didn't have numbers. So from that discussion among these non-monolithic West Slope Roundtables came a Colorado River risk study, of which we're now in phase 3. So the roundtables were befuddled. The Colorado River District and the Southwestern Water Conservation District saw this and came up with the idea of actually developing numbers whereby we could have studied conversations. So the implementer became John Carron of Hydros Consulting in Boulder. And as I said, we're up to phase 3, and there's interesting numbers in there about depletions and by basin and how much is PreCompact and how much is PostCompact. So John, the floor is yours.
Thank you, sir. Thanks to the River District for asking me out here. I don't think I had the chance to say no, but it's good to be here again nevertheless. For those of you who were at the 4 West Slope Basin Roundtable, I apologize in advance. You will have heard a lot of this before. But I want to talk about the risk study and provide a few new insights, hopefully, based on some of the things we've heard today. So I do want to do a quick recap of where we are because it's really nice going last because other people have already said all the things I want to say, so I can talk for a lot less time. Jeff Lucas, Snowpocalypse Whiplash. That's what the future looks like. And I've added a slide, and this is from a presentation that Brad Udall gave just last week. And I really like this because I think it brings home some of this talk about uncertainty and not knowing what the future holds, and it maybe is a little bit more tangible for people who are on the ground working with water. And this is from the Fetcher Ranch up near Steamboat, and this is springtime snowmelt. And so on the x-axis, you've got the years since the early 50s, and then you have the day of the year, and you can see the months there. But this is the date of snowmelt on one of the hay meadows up there. And you can see that what that whiplash effect means on the ground. You have a variability of a couple of months over the last decade and a half or 2 decades. Very early snowmelts and very late snowmelts. 2019, I think we just heard from either Jeff or Brad, is going to be one of the latest snowmelt dates. So that's what we have to look forward to, and that's why it makes predicting and operating under this uncertainty really tricky. A couple other highlights that I just noted. Garbage in means garbage out in the modeling world. It's really important to get the data right. Jesse and Rebecca from Reclamation talked about the DCP and the fact that with the DCP in place, the risk is still not eliminated. And so what do we do about that? Andy talked about the lower basin and the need to get their collective fill in the blank together regarding the structural deficit. But it's not just a lower basin problem, and climate change is showing us that in big ways. And we ignore the science at our own risk. We need to be forthcoming and forthright and intelligent about the information we have and how we use it. And I had to stop there because Poke made me give him the slide presentation, so I didn't really get to update it with Doug and Ann's. But importantly, after this, and really one of the really interesting questions that Doug and Sonia are going to talk about is the economics of demand management. And that, I think, is really an interesting and vital next step following on the heels of this study and the discussion around whether or not demand management makes sense. Okay, so moving forward. This is the attorney's disclaimer that I have to put up here. These results don't represent any official position of the state, the River District, the Southwest District, or anybody else, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. These are my disclaimers. These are the ones that really matter. All models are wrong and some are useful. And we'll talk about that a little bit. I'm going to try to stick to the facts, but I may present some opinions. Those are my opinions and not the River District's or anybody else's. And don't shoot the messenger. And if you were at the meeting that we had back in April, that was directed mostly at the Front Range. So hopefully this is a friendly audience. Jim already talked about the origins of the risk study, so I'm not going to delve into that too much. I just want to talk really briefly about some of the takeaways thus far. We know that the likelihood of some of these bad events happening at Lake Powell are pretty low. But we also know and recognize that if those things do come to pass, the impacts can be astronomical, and the economic impact could be devastating. And so we want to avoid those things. So how do we do that? Another takeaway is that, and we heard a lot about this from Brad and Jeff, but hydrology is the big driver of risk, and we really don't know what the future is going to look like. And so being able to adapt to that unknown is really important. And just mentioned this as well, future growth is a big driver as well. The more water the upper basin consumes, the less water goes down to Lake Powell, the higher the risk of something bad happening at Lake Powell. Pretty simple math. And again, especially in light of climate change and what that may bring in the future, water shortage is not just a lower basin problem. Okay, we're going to bear the brunt, as we've heard, of climate change in the upper basin. Again, this is a little bit of a rehash, but you can see over the last 20 years, in spite of this great year we had, Lake Powell is still bouncing around half full. It would take 5 or 6 more years, just like this year, to fully refill the lake. And I wouldn't count on that moving forward. So in spite of the very good situations on the ground here in the state, the basin as a whole is still in a deficit. Okay. I'm going to talk about really 2 different sets of modeling exercises that we went through. I'm going to talk about modeling that we did with Reclamation's CRSS model, and then I'm going to tell you that that's all wrong, or at least it's not necessarily a good predictor of the future. And then we're going to talk about some work that we've done with the state's state mod model, looking at water rights and pre- and post-compact uses. And then I'm going to tell you we don't want to go there. But nevertheless, I think these are both important topics to talk about because it educates us and helps us understand what the issues are and make informed decisions moving forward. So what does modeling tell us about risk? And first we're going to talk about the big river risk here. So this is using Reclamation's CRSS model. So phase 3 of the risk study, we looked at, used the stress test hydrology, which is the same data set that Reclamation and the basin states used for the DCP process. And we come up with some likelihoods of different events happening in the future. And I'm not going to go into a lot of details because if I reran those models today with new reservoir elevations, the outcome would be different. The key thing to keep in mind here is that there is a risk, and that risk is greater than 0. And yes, things will change from year to year, but we need to be aware that there is a non-zero risk of these things happening. Ann mentioned this already, but an increase in upper basin consumptive use obviously translates into less water going into Lake Powell, all other things being equal, and that increases the risk as well. And really one of the takeaways I think that given the theme of this conference in particular is that we need to plan for the unexpected, and flexibility and adaptability are really, really important moving forward. We have the DCP, the tool of water coming out of the crisp reservoirs if necessary. We're looking at demand management. None of those alone is a silver bullet, and there are lots of other ideas out there as well, but we need to have a tool chest that's flexible and adaptable and that we can bring to bear if and when the time comes. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about water use in Colorado. Is there anybody here who hasn't seen this postcard? Well, I modified it a little bit. You can see the waters in the west. This may well be the state of things in Colorado, but hopefully, and I didn't have time to pull up a picture of everybody hugging, but with respect to the basin as a whole, hopefully the state and the upper basin can act together in unison in securing the water future for Colorado. So, again, we've talked about these before, but preemptive water management options, right? We want to avoid these bad things happening. And what are the tools we have right now? Well, we've got the DCP and the three legs of that stool, if you will, cloud seeding, phreatophyte control, which is an ongoing process and has been for many years, the drought operations of the crisp reservoirs, and the exploration of demand management. And of course, that includes this 500,000 acre-foot pool in one or more of the crisp reservoirs that could be filled with conserved water. Another, I would call it sort of preemptive water management, would be a better deal in the post-2027 world. In other words, what can we do and how can we come to an agreement on how the system as a whole operates that will give us some more certainty and security moving forward. So having said all that, if none of that works, or if the climate deals us a really bad hand, and in spite of having these things in place, we still end up in a bad situation, a compact deficit, then we might actually be looking at curtailment. And so one of the tasks, the second big task of this phase of the study was to look at some of these questions to help inform people and help people understand exactly how much water is being used in the state. What does that look like pre-compact, post-compact, and where are those users and who are they? So I'm going to dive into some of those numbers now. And all of this will be available both on the website, I assume, on the River District website, and we're actually getting close to finalizing the Phase 3 report, so that should be forthcoming sometime this fall. So we just pose these questions and then we'll dive in. So how much Colorado River water does the state use? How much of that water is pre-compact water? How is that water split up across the West Slope basins, including trans-mountain or trans-basin diversions to the East Slope? How much of that post-compact use might be called out? And where are those users? Who are those users? And then we're going to explore a little bit some different options on conceptually ways of sharing the pain. And this gets back to that question of equity and what is an equitable solution that doesn't necessarily doesn't have to follow necessarily prior appropriation either across basins or within basins across users. So, okay. And again, all of these numbers come out of the state's state mod model. So this is not any new information per se. You can go onto the state's website and download these tools and put them on your computer and hit go, and you can extract these numbers. So this is what the state is telling us through its modeling. If you look at the state as a whole, average annual depletions are about 2.5 million acre feet. And you can see there's variation there, and that's no surprise, right? Because, of course, we have dry years, we have wet years, we have years with a summer monsoon, and we have monsoons. which is a new phrase I'm not familiar with, but so there's variability, obviously. And then we have it broken out here by the different subbasins. These subbasins correspond to the model subbasins. So you may look at it and say, why is there a White River subbasin, but the Southwest is lumped as a whole? Simply because those are the discretizations of the model. So given this, and I won't dwell too much on those numbers, you can take a quick look at them. But given this, the key question then is how much of this consumptive use is pre-compact water? And while that may seem like a simple question, there's a lot wrapped up in that as well. What does pre-compact mean? Well, the Project Act, as Eric talked about, was signed in 29, but that was based on the compact itself, which was ratified by 6 of the 7 states in 22. So there's some uncertainty as to exactly what the date of a compact call would be. Similarly, the compact says present perfected rights to the beneficial use of the waters of the Colorado River system are unimpaired by this compact. Okay, well, what does that mean? That doesn't necessarily mean that if you filed or have a water right that's senior to that date, that it, in its entirety, gives you the right to use all that water. It may not have been perfected and put to use. So that seemingly simple question of what is pre-compact water itself has a lot of uncertainty. As a matter of policy, I think it's pretty obvious that the basin states, the upper basin states would want to, if it came to this, clearly would argue to maximize those numbers, right? I mean, we would argue vehemently that for the largest amount of present perfected use and the earliest possible date. So another wrinkle in the question of pre and post compact water is this question of appropriation versus administration dates. And so we took a look at this as well. What the chart is showing there are, on the left, simulated pre-compact consumptive use using the 1922 date, and on the right, simulated pre-compact consumptive use using the 1929 date. And then in blue and red, we've split that out by appropriation date, right, versus administration or adjudication date. And of course, what's going on there is that there are water rights that were appropriated and put to use before the signing of the compact, but for one reason or another, basin adjudications didn't happen or weren't settled until after the date of the compact. My basic takeaway from that is that the difference between 22 and 29 is really not that big. The difference between appropriation date and administration date, it has a bit more teeth to it. That's an extra 150,000 acre feet, so that's pretty significant. You'll also notice, well, I guess we can look at the next slide. So looking at the split between pre and post compact, so we have this average of 2.5 million acre feet of total consumptive use on average. If we look at the pre-compact consumptive use, and the way we did this, and I'm going to dive into some modeling lingo here, so I apologize, but essentially what we did is we assumed that to simulate a compact call, we put a large demand at the bottom of the system with a very high number, very high volume or flow, and essentially called out everybody who is junior to that given date. So they're called out in perpetuity all year long, and we took a look at what was left. And what was left is about 1.6 million acre feet of consumptive use. So that constitutes about, a little less than 2/3 of the total water use in the state that we think is pre-compact water. Just a couple of interesting things to notice in the chart itself. The numbers vary across the basins. The one that really sticks out are the TMDs. And the vast majority of water leaving the basin and going to the east slope is post-compact water. So there's very little pre-compact water that leaves the basin and goes to the east slope. Okay, well, so sort of taking that and then flipping it on its head is who is impacted by curtailment, right? So now we're going to look at the post-compact depletions, and right away the one that will jump out at you is the main stem Colorado. So this is obviously all the users above Grand Junction in the Colorado and all the TMDs, right? And that percentage, so over half of the post-compact rights are trans-mountain rights. And you can see the breakdown across the other basins as well. So, you know, at that point, we have a pretty good idea of what's going on in terms of who's using what water and where it is, how much pre-compact, how much post-compact, and what the impact would be to each of the basins. So at that point, we started to, and this was really driven by the conversations we had with the roundtables, the West Slope Roundtables. So we wanted to ask some additional questions and look at this question of equity and think about, in this case, we're looking at it from the perspective of a compact call, but certainly some of these questions of equity could feed into, say, how you allocate or want to allocate a demand management program, or even if you want to engage in a demand management program. So what if curtailment of all post-compact rights is not the only option? What are some other ways we might think about partitioning up this obligation if we were to have an obligation? So one way to think about this is to say, well, what if there was a compact call? What if the states came to an agreement whereby a full call wasn't required, but we wanted to reduce consumptive uses by a particular volume? And so we're going to look at some different volumes and how deep would the call have to be in order to yield that amount of water. So if you look at that table on the right, we have 3 different volumes. Again, keeping in mind a little over 900,000 is post-compact water. But given those 3 different volumes, 100, 300, and 600,000 acre feet per year, we can go into the model and ask it to tell us what level of seniority would be required to reduce consumptive use by that amount. And again, these are averages. And you know, those numbers, those dates will vary if it's a wet year or a dry year. But on average, this gives you some flavor for how deep a call would have to be in order to yield that much additional flow at the state line or that much reduced consumptive use. And then we split that out even further by basin, and you can see which basins are impacted and how much water would come out of each basin given those different, given those different volumes targets. So as you start to go through this, one of the things that will pop out, I think, is that it's pretty easy to start looking at who are the winners and who are the losers in some of these scenarios, right? You can see whose water was developed earlier, on a basin by basin perspective. The Yampa consumes a relatively small amount of water, and yet for some of these target volumes, it's contributing an awful lot, and that's because it was developed more slowly. Again, I'm not saying that's right or wrong, it's a question of equity. But again, this is part of that educating and informing process. We can also look at it a little bit differently, and again, I'm throwing these up fairly quickly, and it takes quite a while to digest these, but this will all be available both in the report and in these slides. So what does a statewide call look like for each basin? And there you get an idea of the relative volumes that would come out of each basin given those statewide target totals. Okay. So the assumption thus far has been that there's a single call, right? We have a single call that applies across the state. Well, another way that we might think about implementing a call or a demand management scheme or anything else, would be to prorate the reductions in use across the basins based on some other mechanism. So for example, and this concept is essentially Basin X uses 25% of the water of the state as a whole, that's post-compact water, then perhaps that basin should only contribute 25% to the solution, if you will, right? So this might be a more equitable way to spread the pain and not have basins that have developed more slowly actually end up bearing more of the burden. So we're going to take a look at some numbers that we developed using that idea, and we look at those both across or within the basins. We also look at it between West Slope and East Slope users. So for example, about, and I just use the Yampa again as an example, not to pick on them. In the top line here, you see for each of those basins what % of post-compact water they consume relative to the state as a whole. So the Yampa consumes about 6.3% of all the post-compact water that's consumed by the state. One way to think about this would be to say, well, okay, let's say the state has to generate 300,000 acre feet in a call. Well, the Yampa's contribution to that 300,000 acre feet would be 6.3%, almost 19,000 acre feet. And so that approach then, we can go back and say, well, okay, Yampa, if you have to give us 19,000 acre feet, if we have to curtail uses by that amount, what priority date would you have to call in the Yampa in order to get that much water conserved and down to the state line? And so then we have a whole other set of tables that look at that question. And you can see, and I'll just pause here for a minute, but you can see, depending on the yields that you're after, and looking across those basins, you see some pretty different administration dates that would be required in those different basins in order to yield those volumes of water. Dates that vary by, 20 or 30, maybe even 40 years in some cases. And again, that's just an indication that, the state hasn't developed uniformly in terms of its water use. Just another way to look at the same set of data. And again, it becomes obvious in a pure administration sense who the winners and losers would be. And if we want to have an equitable solution, if it ever got to this point, simply doing administration across the state as a whole might not be as equitable as some other approaches. And I think I have a couple more slides here. So that concept of statewide versus in-basin, again, this is just another way to look at the same data set. But if we compare basin by basin, how much water would be coming out of each basin under this statewide approach versus a basin-specific approach, this really highlights where those differences are. And you can see, the Yampa, for example, would be hurt much more by a statewide call than would the Southwest, where there's a relatively larger number of older rights. Some of the basins, it really doesn't matter a whole lot, the White and the Gunnison. And even the Colorado as a whole really don't vary that much when you look at statewide versus in-basin. Now, having said that, for the Colorado, you can see that the split between the in-basin users and the TMDs do vary quite a bit when you start asking that question of statewide call versus basin-specific call. So this is for 100,000 acre feet. This is the same information, but for the 300,000 acre foot contribution and the 600,000 acre foot contribution. And then finally, another question that was posed, well, what if we look at in-basin versus trans-mountain water, and what does that look like? And so we took a look at what it would take, what the call levels would be in the Colorado main stem in order to yield, again, those same amounts of water, but with essentially allocating that responsibility across the in-basin users and the trans-mountain users based on their percentage of use of PostCompact water. And again, you can see some variability here between what happens if you treat the system as a whole, in other words, east and west together, versus in-basin uses and TMDs split out. Okay, so just some general observations to wrap up. Colorado consumes about 2.5 million acre feet of water each year on average. Roughly 2/3 of that is PreCompact water. 900,000 is PostCompact. And of that 900,000, the biggest proportion of that water, almost 60%, is trans-mountain water. And so when I say don't shoot the messenger, that was for anybody who was from the East Slope who might happen to be here. And because of that, the Colorado main stem itself comprises over 2/3 of all that PostCompact use. Just a couple of little interesting things. The big TMDs, you know, they as a unit consume and divert so much water that in many of these scenarios where you're trying to generate some amount of water, the TMDs often end up being the swing call. So they cover large chunks of that target demand, if you will, and are partially or fully called out in a lot of those scenarios. And finally, and this seems pretty obvious, certainly based on the results, but you know, there really is a question of equity here, and depending on how you choose to allocate a call or implement a call, you'll have substantially different outcomes across the basins and within the basins. All of this is really good information. I think it's important for people to understand. I think it, in many ways, can help inform the conversation around who should be bearing the responsibility for doing demand management, if in fact we end up going down that road. But it also, in my mind, I think that the likelihood of getting to this point, I hope the likelihood of getting to this point is low for many of the reasons that have already been discussed. The uncertainty associated with a call and what the impact of that would have on our economy, I think is far greater than the risk or what we might give up in coming to a negotiated solution that gives us a lot more certainty and a lot more security moving forward. So in light of the theme of this conference, and especially in light of the climate apocalypse that we heard about earlier, this is my parting thought. We are outside the box, both in terms of our climate and our hydrology and where we're headed. And we need to think that way. And we have to be thinking about flexible solutions and have as many different tools in our toolbox as we can moving forward. With that, I'm done. Thank you.
Questions? Yes, sir. We're going to get a mic to you.
Sure.
Oh, here it comes. Here it comes.
John, the tribal water expectations and that versus their current use in the pre-compact, how did you handle that? And how much influence does it have in the outcome that you presented?
Yeah, so the short answer is we really didn't. And the reason that we didn't, and in particular if you're talking about the recent tribal study. So we used the state's baseline state mod model. And that model, while it has some tribal uses in it, particularly in the Southwest, it did not incorporate any of the recent demand numbers that came out of that tribal study. And so to the extent that those are in that baseline model, they were included. But that is a big source of uncertainty, and part of, and folks here from the Southwest I might point to, and who could offer a better answer than I, but one of the interesting things about some of those rights is that through agreements, through operational agreements, they've actually been subordinated for purposes of in-state administration, right? I mean, they become part of the Dolores project, or they're part of things that are going on in some of those basins in the Southwest. But that in-state administration tool is very different, I think, than what would happen under a compact call, where those tribal rights would almost certainly be prior and paramount and senior to the compact. So my evasive answer is we just used what was in the model.
What level of impact does that assumption have, if it went one way or the other?
Well, I don't know that it, I don't know that it has a huge impact, because my assumption, correct or not, would be that all of that tribal water would be pre-compact water, and so it wouldn't be subject to a call. So I think if you're asking about, how would it affect, the distribution of post-compact water, I really don't think it would that much. So I don't think it has a huge impact on these particular numbers. Certainly has a huge impact on our ability to move water downstream, and how much total consumptive use might be pre-compact, though, absolutely.
I don't see another question, but I'll make an observation. I can tell you through my work with the roundtables that these numbers have gotten the attention of the Front Range diverters. And in fact, through demand management work group that we've established with the Colorado Basin Roundtable, Kirsten Karath, who is from Grand Junction, is the chair, we're endeavoring to start conversations with some of our colleagues on the Front Range about these things. And finally, there was a tour of the Colorado Big Thompson project, of which board members of the River District and staff and others from the West Slope attended. And we heard from the new general manager of the Northern Water that they're willing to participate, and they're conscious of equity, and that they would make their contributions from their use of water on the Front Range, that they wouldn't come after West Slope Ag. So couple developments there, but the bottom line is these numbers have gotten people's attention.
Yeah, and absolutely. And in fact, we spent quite a bit of time talking to folks from the Front Range Water Council, and really confirming this isn't a huge surprise to them. They've been doing their own modeling. That's not unexpected. But they've gotten the same numbers that we have. So they have done this. They see the writing on the wall. They understand that the biggest burden of post-compact water curtailment falls on them. So.
Yeah, so I guess, one final postscript is that through this work and the Front Range Water Council's work, which I know there's conversations to compare where numbers are falling, is the idea is, as Andy talked about earlier, is to have at least a common basis of knowledge for which we can launch difficult policy discussions. So that's really what these numbers are about. And it was really revelatory when we saw this at the Four Basin Roundtable meeting. And yeah, I can't wait for phase 4. So thank you very much, John.
Thanks.